I'm going to delve into some of these issues that you've just raised in a little bit more detail on our first panel discussion. If I could invite to the stage the Right Honourable Tobias Ellwood, Dr. Nooralhaq Nasimi, and Professor Michael Cox, the founder and director of LSE Ideas and Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics. If you could join me, please. Thank you. Tobias, you gave us such a detailed analysis, and in so many ways, although I come from Afghanistan originally myself, I do agree with you. This is a very, very challenging situation that has no right approach. But you also said we now need a different approach to Afghanistan, because what we have been trying to do over the last 20 years hasn't worked. And Afghanistan continues to pose more and more of a threat, whether that's to do with human rights abuses, the terrorism risk to the region and the West. I'd love to know a little bit more detail in terms of what you think the UK's response to the situation in Afghanistan should be. But also, how do we prevent a response from us that would justify what they've been doing to the country, whether that's their affiliation to terrorist groups, they're just justifying banning girls from school. How do we prevent us being seen as allowing that to persist? And what message that might send to other groups who believe in the same values as the Taliban around the world? That are we okay? Are we allowing this to continue? And we're willing to engage with a group like that? And finally, just a quick thing on potentially working towards finding an alternative solution for Afghanistan in the years to come. If you think that's even possible, do you think there is scope for us to work around a democratic opposition in the next few years? We don't know, the situation in the country is very fragile. Who knows whether the Taliban may persist and may remain. Is there an opportunity that we're missing with looking towards an alternative solution?
Well, thank you for that. Firstly, let's divide up what happened over the last 20 years with what's happened over the last 2 years. Because, as I said, I don't believe that we've done justice to understand how we failed in Afghanistan. As I say, we lost a lot of brave personnel. They created this incredible security umbrella for which very little happened that was coordinated. And I visited the country many times, was wanting to meet a Paddy Ashdown type character, if I can use that phrase, if you understand that, who did such a great job in Bosnia. There was nobody in Afghanistan coordinating all the NGO work. There was nobody that recognized the history of the country, the tribal structures and so forth. There was nobody bringing all that together. The big chiefs, the important people, were the military. And they read up on it, and they learned what the Durrand Line was. They learned who Dost Mohammed was over time. They learned the Treaty of Gandamak, the Battle of Kandahar. But they learnt it once they were there. That's too late. You need to be understanding what your mission is before you went there. And as I touched on, we had mission creep. This was the war on terror. We wandered in, and I think there was an arrogance that we could just wander across the world, stamp our authority anywhere. And when it wasn't really working out in Afghanistan, arguably some say that we then moved to Iraq to do something similar there. And it's been a very, very bruising experience for NATO and others as well. The second part, and you're absolutely right to say, does any engagement somehow qualify what they're doing? Absolutely not. You began this this important discussion here today by listing all the things that we need to be keeping front and center and reminding the world. My question is, what strategy is able to influence what's going on? And when you absent yourself from the country, when you hand the country back to the very insurgency that you went in to defeat, you then lose leverage. And what I saw is a country, as I say, where terrorism, the economy, human rights and so forth, they require international support. I saw also divisions within the Taliban. We need to better understand all that to ask ourselves whether we can actually leverage that. The final point I'd say as well is that the lessons in Afghanistan are important to learn, because I spent a lot of time speaking about how complex and worrying decade we've now entered. It's going to be bumpy, what's going on. There's a 1930s to the feel to the world right now. And when we didn't sort out Afghanistan, it reminded me that we wandered into Somalia, we wandered into Yemen, we wandered into Libya, Iraq, Syria, and so forth. Yemen, all these countries we dabbled with, somehow got bored, didn't have the strategic patience, and then left. And that isn't good statecraft whatsoever. It also damages the international reputation and leaves countries scarred, as we saw. We've abandoned 40 million people. My question is, how do we best do justice to what is going on there today? And that's why what we're talking about this evening is so important. Thank you.
And the final point I also mentioned around a democratic alternative for Afghanistan and whether that's something that we have an opportunity to develop now, considering the element of whether the Taliban will remain or not. Should we be involved in supporting the Afghan population to develop that mobilised movement, or what role should the UK play?
Well, I think the first... I lost my... Here we go. I think the first thing to do, and I touched on it politely, is that we need to rekindle the budget to support the humanitarian efforts that are going in so the UN programmes can actually work. I understand that the head of UNAMA needs about $4.5 billion for a year's worth. She's got about she's got about $500 million to be able to work. So she's missing about $4 billion to do all those things to provide the humanitarian programs. So it shows where the country is actually going. That can be reversed. You're now moving into areas which I'm not qualified, and indeed it would be dangerous to do, because that's exactly what I'm afraid my predecessors who were ministers tried to do back in 2001, 2002, is impose without speaking to good people like yourselves who actually know more about where things can actually go and where you actually want to be and how best to achieve that.
Thank you, Tobias. I'll quickly move to Dr. Nasimi. You are originally from Afghanistan yourself, and you've been helping its people not only in the UK and Europe, but in the country through humanitarian efforts. I know that you very regularly talk around the diaspora movement and how the diaspora can go about getting support from UK and other Western allies to deliver a different future for Afghanistan. What's your take on how we develop that mobilization and that representation, true representation, as Tobias mentioned, that comes from the people of Afghanistan and their needs for their own country?
I think since Afghanistan never was or never been directly colonized, and the people of Afghanistan, that's why they can't speak any foreign languages. They are the only people in the world to express their feeling, concerns, the challenges they face. They can't speak any foreign languages. And the migration also is very new to the Western society. And looking the complexity and the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, as well as the integration, the challenges the refugees facing in integration into the Western society, it seems to me that we will never achieve to bring any changes inside Afghanistan if we do not have a proper, maybe diaspora movement or diaspora representation. As you know that we don't have any representation in any country, in any country's politics, including in the United Kingdom. We don't have a councillor, we don't have an MP, we don't have anyone in EU Parliament or EU's Congress to convey our messages. Yeah? And that's why I would like to use the opportunities today, while we have Tobias and other great politicians, to make sure that they can have a debate specifically on Afghanistan during the parliamentary debate on Wednesdays. Maybe just they can include in their agenda one items about the humanitarian crisis and how we can tackle together in partnership with the diaspora community. At the moment, there is no formal diaspora council, there is no formal diaspora movements, which I discussed before the event with Keith Bass, the former MP. Of course, we're pleased to run an organization like this, helping on a grassroots level in a very small scale to the people who are living locally. But we shouldn't forget that we have millions of refugees in Pakistan. We have millions in Iran. They don't have any voice. 100,000 in Turkey, 100,000 in Greece, and millions in the EU. And they face some inequality, injustice, discrimination. We're very pleased to be here in the United Kingdom because we don't see any kind of discrimination or inequality. For example, in Germany, some of the refugees, they are complaining because of the different approach from the different German authorities toward the Syrian and the Afghanistani community. So this is I don't want to talk too much on this, but I would like to re-emphasize the importance of launching or having some kind of recognition from the Foreign Office, from the House of Parliament, in terms of launching an official diaspora movements if they can't do anything with having an opposition in exile, which the Syrian they have, or an opposition, or maybe a government in exile, which of course I don't think that, looking at the mood of the politicians since the fall of Afghanistan, either we shall have to do it by ourselves, by bringing communities together, unifying people, but unification and unifying people is impossible after 45 years of war. As Tobias mentioned about, because of the tribal differences, the cultural differences, and the conflicts every tribe they have between themselves. So if we can't maybe have the support to set up an opposition in exile or a government in exile, at least we should move forward to have some kind of diaspora movement where we can represent the diaspora community and helping them through humanitarian assistance, resettlement programs, and all other necessary needs that they need from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What's really interesting is, in the context of Afghanistan, there's never actually been a structure, a political, parliamentary structure, opposition movements. We've had regimes, whether it was the Republic, monarchy, or the Taliban regime now. The concept of an opposition movement is very foreign for the people of Afghanistan, which is probably one of the reasons why mobilizing and coming together has become so difficult. And I agree with your point earlier, Tobias, as well, that it's much better to listen to what Afghans need now rather than make the mistake of imposing a system that doesn't fit with the cultural, religious, political dynamic of the country. But one thing that's missing here is that the people of Afghanistan themselves can't find that solution. Unfortunately, the country has gone through decades of war. That infrastructure, that knowledge base and expertise isn't there, which is where many Afghans still, to this day, are asking for the support to at least provide that platform so that they can be heard. And I don't think that's still made available, which is where the grievances sort of come about. And last but not least, I'll move on to really quickly to Professor Cox before coming to the audience, because I'm sure you've got questions directed towards our excellent panelists. Michael, you've previously looked at NATO's attempt at nation building and why that failed in Afghanistan. Could you give us a bit of your take on lessons learned and what you think the future holds for the long-suffering people of Afghanistan?
Lessons. You never learn anything from history. Indeed, one of the authors in the book I edited, you can get it free online, by the way. You don't get much free in this country, but you can get my book free online, okay, from the NSC. Look, I want to kind of maybe shift the discussion a bit back to the international side of it, if I could. And I don't mean this in any sense as a criticism of Afghanistan, quite the reverse, not at all. One of the reasons I did this book was as a commitment to Afghanistan when the West was losing interest rapidly, A, because they felt ashamed, B, because they cut and run, and because the war in Ukraine is more important. Let's be perfectly blunt about it. And it was the Soviet Union where this huge tragedy, in a sense, originated, which I think you said back in '79. I was a Sovietologist, and I was studying Soviet foreign policy. And typical of most academics, I was utterly surprised when the Soviet Union made the utterly stupid and criminal decision to intervene, but they did. And we've been left in the shadow and the mess of all that ever since. It's a legacy of the Cold War in many ways. But I want to make another point, it's a larger point. Afghanistan only comes up on our radar, my radar, not the radar of Afghan people. It only comes up on the radar of us when it becomes internationally significant. So when the Soviet Union intervened and it became part of the Cold War, then guess what? People who didn't even know where Afghanistan was, didn't know where Kabul was, didn't know the difference between a Shia and a Sunni, suddenly got interested. And of course that became the last war of the Cold War, which the Americans and the British in some crude sense fought rather effectively, because in the end it led Gorbachev to being pushed out 10 years later. But we only got interested when it was of international significance. And what happened there afterwards? Interest collapsed, totally collapsed, after 79 and 80, 81, right through into the 1990s. And why did we get interested again? Because 4 planes, as bombs, were used and attacked the United States on that heinous day of 9/11. And suddenly the West woke up to the fact that Afghanistan wasn't just this country somewhere between Russia and India, the classical British view in the Great Game, as you well know, but Afghanistan actually became the source of a major international threat to the international community and to the United States more specifically. And it was the US who really determined the whole strategy in Afghanistan, let's be honest. NATO wasn't unimportant, I'm not playing it down, it was the biggest commitment by NATO ever after the end of the Cold War. But in the end, it was the US which determined. And it was the US which in the end determined to get out. And Trump began it. I think Biden wanted to do it anyway. We shouldn't have been so surprised. But the way it was done, the cut and run, I mean, it was shameful. Totally shameful. The logic, the consequence of all this is, and this is what worries me, really, the international community is losing interest again. We've got to be blunt about it, and that's why it's so important, the work you do and what Tobias does, and those who kind of want to talk about Afghanistan in a period of time when most people want to talk about the war in Ukraine, because it's seen as more significant, more of a threat to Europe, more of a threat to the world economy. And I think one of the reasons, again, I did this book, and I keep advertising it, but it is free, is to simply say, we mustn't forget Afghanistan. We mustn't forget Afghanistan, not just for humanitarian reasons, or not because of the treatment of women, and not just because of the treatment of others who are non-Pashtun. It's almost Pashtun government incomplete. Or not just because of the economic left. All those things are morally and ethically and politically important, because if we leave a space governed by certain kinds of people, it will come back to bite us. That is, I think you were pushing at that, Tobias. Now, it may not be another 9/11, it may not be another attack of that description or that quantity, but nonetheless, the idea that somehow or another it will leave us alone. And you quoted that one, you know, it was a quote from somebody else as well, you know. You may want to forget about Afghanistan, but Afghanistan won't let you forget about the world. And that's why I think it's so important, the work you're doing and the commitment that Tobias and others have had. And I just really want to say that we should not congratulate ourselves now in the West. And I know there's a whole debate to be had about the Ukraine war. We should not congratulate ourselves today and say, oh, thank God, the West is back united together after the disaster of what happened on August the 15th and then finally on August the 31st, the day of shame, in my view. And I held my head in shame. And I know Tobias and many others, you know, friends of mine. Can I just say one other little quick thing to what Tobias said? And I lived in Northern Ireland for 22 years, and it's a great place, by the way. It's fantastic. Go and visit it. It is very nice. You'll be more than welcome. But there are lessons from the peace process in Northern Ireland, and I knew a number of the people who were involved in that peace process. I can't tell you how difficult it was to get the Good Friday Agreement up and running, just about. It was really unbelievable. Everybody I was talking to at the time, I was at Queen's University in Belfast, we all said, we're never going to get a peace in Northern Ireland. The war will go on interminably and forever and ever and ever. How did we arrive at a peace? I don't want to go into complicated academic stuff, but let me just say one thing. In the end, the British government and the Irish government, and I give enormous praise to the Irish government here, by the way, and enormous praise to the European Union, and by the way, enormous praise to Bill Clinton as well, who played a very key, and Tony Blair, sorry about that, I have to mention Tony Blair just once, played an enormous role. And what did they say? And Jonathan Powell, who was a good friend of mine, who was there very much involved in those negotiations, said, you've got to talk to people you hate. You've got to talk to people you don't like. Because the provos would have gone on with that war for another 15 or 20 years. They weren't beaten militarily, they were contained, but they weren't beaten. Now, whether that has any lessons for Afghanistan, I'll leave up to others to discuss, but maybe drawing some parallels back in the past to my own experiences in Northern Ireland, and how we arrived at something we thought would be impossible. And that, I think, is at least a lesson to be drawn. Thanks very much for listening. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll be very brief. My name's Guy Smallman, I'm a journalist. I worked on and off in Afghanistan for a decade. My contacts in Jalalabad and Nangarhar province, which borders Pakistan, are telling me now that that is an area where you've got this new terrorist group who are trying to take over villages in that area. They're trying to set up bases. And the one issue across the entire country is the price of food. And people in those outlying villages out in the countryside, they're starving. And ISIS-K have got money. And you're creating a situation with these sanctions, you know, and rocketing food prices, which is making these areas vulnerable to possibly being taken over by something much, much worse than the Taliban. So I'd like to ask the panel's view on whether the sanctions that are being imposed at the moment are actually working, or should they be scrapped?
Thank you. I'll let you, Tobias, answer that one.
The hard question.
Well, so firstly, you illuminate exactly what we need to better understand. We need information such as you, such as journalists, to expose exactly what's going on. Because only then can we discuss those in an adult fashion, in a sober fashion, in a mature fashion, to say what is the consequences of us continuing with our current approach, including the sanctions themselves. And we touched on the danger of ISK and what they're going on. They are able to give more money, and the worry privately that expressed by the Taliban is that people are leaving the Taliban because they can earn more money with ISIS-K. So that's exactly why we need to be concerned about where things are going. And ultimately it's affecting the Afghan people, and we've lost sight of that. So it goes back to this bigger, I don't have the answers, but I know that the questions we need to be asking are going to be difficult. But if we don't ask them, then what you're describing will absolutely continue and will come to haunt us, absolutely, if we don't react to it. So thank you for raising that.
The gentleman at the back, you've had your hand up for a while, so I'll let you ask.
Yeah, thank you all very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst. never worked in Afghanistan, but did work in Pakistan and Central Asia. And I can certainly reinforce the very sad but very necessary message that Mr. Ellwood has put, that the total arrogance and lack of coordination in far too many Western organizations. Far too many. Ignorance and arrogance of history. I saw that in Ukraine as well, with devastating consequences. My question is there any particular logistic organizational route that the international organizations, however flawed they are, can keep some support and partly keep at bay famine and starvation, and particularly also, just a quick one, where's the money of ISIS-K coming from? A lot of the talk about drugs trafficking is, I think, in danger of becoming very outdated. Thank you.
Michael, Tobias, whoever thinks you can answer.
Well, I suppose I could come up with the easy answer and call it the United Nations. But that also, in a sense, being blunt again, one of our problems at the moment that we don't have now a United Nations.
Amen to that.
And this is the tragedy of our time. This is the tragedy of our time. The UN is now as divided, if not more so, than it was during the Cold War. And on every single major vote of international significance, China and Russia will be on one side of that, and UK, France, and the United States will be on the other. So I suppose the simple answer, but it's not an answer, is to get the UN as it was originally conceived of, in a great moment of idealism and realism too, by the way, when the UN was created back at the end of the Second World War, and get it to work together. And in a way, what Afghanistan reveals to me, and this is not an answer to your question, all I keep coming up with is problems, but then I am an academic after all, so that's what I'm paid to do, I suppose. I leave the politicians to come up with solutions, or not, is that we just don't have that international community. And I think what's going to be working out, and again, this is a bit of a miserable answer to your good question, the great game is yet again being played out across the mountains and the valleys of Afghanistan. We're almost back in the 19th century when the British and the Russians were fighting. They didn't really care about Afghanistan. The British want to keep the Russians out of India and away from the Persian Gulf, and to maintain the control over its jewel in the crown called the Raj. It wasn't about Afghanistan at all. And I think the same great game is now being played out. I mean, can one imagine Putin working in solidarity with any of the Western powers, even on some agreed program of aid? No. China maybe, but here again, I'm not convinced about that. I regard Russia and China somewhat differently, obviously, partly because they got a lot more money and they're not involved in a war invading another person's country. So I think therein lies the problem. So if you ask me the question, which international organisation? I would have to say probably, can the G7 do it? Can the G20 do it? Can we do it through some other organisation? I'm not optimistic on that, because unless the great powers or the big powers and those with the money work together, then you've got a problem. You've got a problem, and I just don't see that cooperation coming on. So I don't want to see Afghanistan fall for another big great game, which didn't do Afghanistan much good in the very first place in the 19th century. But I think that lies at the heart of some of the problems we're going to be facing going forward. I don't know if you agree with that. Tobias?
I'm really trying to grapple, we've elevated the debate on Afghanistan in the last few days to really focus on the detail, the problems and the challenges. For me, and I served in Bosnia, I was in Kuwait, I've been involved in reconstruction and development most of my life. And often it's an individual personality that is able, and I mentioned Paddy Ashdown, and I would like to see the West have a single empowered representative that doesn't have to lean on the UN, but is endorsed perhaps by the UN to be that envoy that can actually then be empowered to be able to communicate. I mentioned Thomas West, but he's a very young diplomat, and you can tell that the Americans are not taking this seriously at all.
No.
But you think what, a Jimmy Carter, a Kissinger, somebody else like that can actually do, maybe not Kissinger, but he's obviously comes with mixed views. But all I'm saying is somebody with the status, the gravitas, that then could be empowered to understand the real issues. Because you mentioned, you leave it to politicians. Politicians don't understand Afghanistan. I'm the only MP that's actually been to Afghanistan since it fell. That can't be right. That really cannot be right. And when I dare to then, shine some light on it, and I agree, the wording I chose, the point is that the backlash you get because people don't really want to be reminded of what happened after 20 years, the massive sacrifices. So this is a very challenging, very complex issue. But the more we do nothing, the more the country slides into perhaps a very, very difficult space. And we need to ask ourselves some very, very tough questions about how we see Afghanistan today and how we can best, advance and support. I'm always reminded of the 40 million people, I say that, and the next thing is the plight of the women and the girls. And what's not been mentioned, I think there's some music coming later, is then what's happening with music there as well. Is the actual culture is being sat on too. Well, we can't influence Afghanistan by wagging our finger from afar when we've absented ourselves from the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. I just wanted to really emphasise the point that although Afghanistan is challenging and there are many problems, there is no one solution. That doesn't mean that we need to be silenced on the matter. And I'm very thankful that we have platforms like this where we can just be honest that we need to find solutions. I'll take another question, but I'll take it from a woman this time. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. One of the things we haven't discussed so far is the channel crossings. In the last week alone, there were 2 channel crossings where people were killed in the English Channel. We are putting forward policies that are barbaric and inhumane, putting people on flights to Rwanda that they've never been to, putting people on barges with their infected water. It is utterly disgraceful. What can we do as British public from this side to create a more equitable and welcoming environment for those people who are arriving, who have been traumatised, who have been through such trauma, whilst still looking into that foreign policy, that foreign effort of building a stronger and more resilient and more equitable Afghanistan? We can't ignore the chaos that is happening right now and the problems that we have caused in the last few years that are leading people to come to our shores.
Do you want me to answer?
I think you should answer. You were the advisor, you
got the inside track.
Look, I think the problem we have is the mechanisms around resettlement. First of all, the UK has had almost 5 different resettlement schemes back to back. You had the Syrian, the Hong Kongers, and then the Afghans, and then within very small time frame, the Ukrainians. It is a lot for a country, a small island like the UK to take. I think sometimes we're also not taking that step back to realise that the UK can't do it all. Of course, as a global actor, the reliance on the UK is quite big on us to step up and take on our moral duty, but it is difficult. We are dealing with a cost of living crisis, the pandemic, and so many other challenges. But aside from that, I think the problem that we continuously have with safe legal routes is the resettlement schemes that we do have are not in some ways fit for purpose, particularly when it comes to Afghans. The Afghan resettlement scheme and the Arab scheme are not in some ways understanding of the political, geopolitical, security, cultural, religious element of Afghanistan, also the neighbouring countries that surround a landlocked country like Afghanistan. The Syrian resettlement scheme, many Syrian refugees were able to flee to their neighbouring countries. Most Afghans can't do that. They're not issued visas in Pakistan or Iran or Uzbekistan. A lot of them are hiding. And so, for me personally, I mean, having worked on the ACRS, it's not fit for purpose. And I think it really does. It's important for us to create systems that can be practical and not just introduce schemes that are just to show that we're doing something, but not to put into practice. And it is unfortunate that 2 years on, some of these schemes have not actually been able to deliver on what was promised. So that's my very quick take on that. Thank you. I'll move on to one final comment. Let's keep it specific to Afghanistan. Oh, where is that? There we go. Yes, if you could. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this opportunity, Dr. Nasimi. Assalamu alaikum for everybody. I'm a person who have worked with Afghans locally for the last 10 years. I've been worked with international community who funded Afghanistan, so I'm still having a very close relation with my fellow Afghans in almost 18 countries. The thing that worries me, I know that it might be a repetitive discussion, but in terms of humanitarian aid, there is a chain, a mafia selected group that kind of been involved for the last 2 years. You have team leaders, tribal leaders that decides where the humanitarian aid should go and how it should go, and mostly it go to the families that they sell it back to the open market. That's the truth. That's the truth, because I've lead that team on an organization of anti-corruption, so I know the numbers very closely. The majority of the funding that goes through UN, you know that 40% of that goes to their administrative costs. That is another big issue that needs to be challenged within international team leaders who could see that this is not helping Afghans. And thirdly, what I would like to have a question is from a professor, which I totally respect your thoughts, and I support that the brutal honesty that you have said toward Afghanistan, and we would have a discussion about it as well if you had the opportunity to do that. But is it, respected professor, what do you think Afghanistan with the next 5 to 10 years with the current situation, if we move forward slowly? And respected MP, what do you think from your prospect, what is the perception of UK government for another decade if this current group is still governing Afghanistan, and what would be the approach to that, and what would be the reality of that? Thank you.
I'll divide that up really quickly, but please keep your answers really short. Humanitarian aid, if you can come on that, and how to make sure the money is reached by people in need. And then if you guys take the 2 other questions that were directed at you. Do you want to start, Tobias?
Well, you asked me what's going to happen in Afghanistan. I couldn't tell what's going to happen in Great Britain in 2 or 3 years, 5 years' time, let alone a complicated country such as Afghanistan. My message today was, the call to action was, don't let's keep watching it from afar, but let's engage. That is my key message, that we can do more with the leverages that we have, conscious of what was said earlier, that there's no endorsement of any behavior whatsoever, quite the opposite. It's having great opportunity to challenge, and that's what we actually need to do. So I genuinely don't know. I don't think anybody can know. Sir, I'm not sure you'll be able to predict. But what I'm saying is that we have sent ourselves even further, then we have no ability to change things whatsoever. And I spelled out from a terrorism, a humanitarian crisis, and an economic crisis that could be looming. They are the dangers, they're the perils that can lie ahead. And we need to recognize that by engaging, we can perhaps thwart those and move and advance Afghanistan into a far better place.
Yeah. One can never predict the past or the rewriting of the past, let alone predict the future. But the simple answer is that we don't know what the future holds, but it will depend on what we do. I mean, that's it. I mean, history is not a machine. What happens doesn't just have to happen. It's not overdetermined. It's what we choose to do or choose not to do. It's decisions taken by politicians, public opinion. But I'd also say one other thing, and I here get back to the United States. It's going to depend a lot on what happens in the United States over the next year. Let's be perfectly honest about it. Britain is a wonderful country, but it's no longer the great superpower of many years ago. The European Union is a major player and an actor, and I want to see it doing more, and it's doing quite a lot more in Afghanistan and quite a lot of others, and I applaud that. But let's be perfectly honest, all roads lead to Washington, as we found out last August. And it's decisions taken there. And again, this may be too much academic brutality coming from the LSE. I do apologise. I can't say I'm talking on behalf of the LSE, I'm talking on behalf of myself. But at the moment, the situation in the United States doesn't look entirely favourable. let's be perfectly honest about where the future lies. I mean, after all, I think Biden, who I prefer to Trump, I'll say that without any hesitation. Nonetheless, we still face in 2024 the possibility of a return of a Republican administration, which, even if it's not Donald Trump, it'll be a lookalike Donald Trump. And I can't imagine for a minute that they will be re-engaging in any way. So, in many ways, it's going to be sitting in the hands of what goes on inside the United States. That doesn't give us a lot of leverage over the situation. We can do our best, as Tobias and others have done, and I try to do my own minor way through academic work, but we've just got to keep hanging away on that.
If I may, I just want to add something about Britain's involvement and our place in the world, because I actually came into politics because I think Britain has a role as a force for good on the international stage. And if I'm frank, as we're being today, and blunt, we've actually lost that art, that skill set, to be able to influence our closest security ally, to whisper in their ear, for example, don't, Second World War, D-Day landings, don't go to Calais, Normandy is a much better option. It's little things that when working with the United States, our bigger security friend, they value our connectivity, our history, our understanding of the world, in offering solutions to difficult problems. But because of where the Foreign Office is today, perhaps a bit distracted, because of the last decade or so, we have become risk averse. And I'm really pleased that Ukraine was an example of us rekindling that ability to step forward when other nations hesitate. I just wish we could start to do that with Afghanistan. Thank you.
So, while I'm very positive about, as a whole, about the British culture and the British hospitality, I think also that's why we love Great Britain, because of its democratic values and democracy, freedom of speech. And I think sometimes it makes sense that we also have to criticize politicians about certain things. And for example, after the fall of Afghanistan, we haven't seen any activities run by the APPG, the Afghanistan Parliamentary Group, which made me very sad. Yeah. Most of the APPGs, they are in operation, the Ukrainian, the Syrian, the Yemenis, Palestinian. When there is a demonstration in Trafalgar Square to support the Palestinian people, there are 100,000 people participate in peaceful demonstration in Trafalgar Square. In the case of Afghanistan, today we had a small gathering opposite the House of Parliament. Thanks to the British press and media, we had a lot of TV and press, but the number of British people participating in this gathering in order to show some sympathy and solidarity to the people of Afghanistan was very low. So what I want to conclude my talk, answering some of the questions that I heard from the audience, and also to give the second panel the opportunity to also to talk, because the time is over. While we have an important politician like Tobias in this community center, so this is the first community center that the people of Afghanistan run around the world. And that's why I'm very positive about the British democracy and hospitality. We don't have any similar community center in the United States, or in Germany, or in Canada, or in any part of the EU. And the second floor, we have some rooms, 6 rooms. When you come at 9 a.m., there is so many staff, volunteers, the beneficiaries, they are queuing to get some advice. Here in this hall, we are running English classes, women empowerment, mental health workshops, and so many other things. Capacity building. the most important things that I found in my life as a community leader is lack of diaspora engagement in local life. And integration is a very long-term process. When we see the Prime Minister is from India, Rishi Sunak, it doesn't mean that after the migration of the South Asian in the UK after the Second World War, they become the Prime Minister. No, because the Indian or the Indian subcontinent, they are living with the British system for the past 300 years. So now you can imagine how we are the most devastated and fragile and disadvantaged and isolated people in the world. And that's why I'm talking with some interruption to ask the British politicians, please do not consider us as more established community, because we don't know how to explain things properly. We can't speak the language properly. Yeah. So the Diaspora Council should have the recognition from the Foreign Office. This is just a suggestion. I don't want to insist or impose, considering the fragile situation that we have. And then the humanitarian aids, again, how do we make sure there is a transparency and accountability in place inside Afghanistan? If we didn't have transparency and accountability under Ashraf Ghani and Karzai administration, while we had hundreds of embassies in Kabul, and also the British embassy in Afghanistan, but then corruption, Afghanistan became the most corrupt country in the world. Yeah, how can you make sure that the money will spent by the Taliban to the poor people in the villages? And that's why I mentioned a number of times. Last winter we lost hundreds of lives of children. Yeah, and we don't want to see the same tragic situation in the upcoming winter. We need to take some preventative measure. We need funding. The local organizations should be engaged in humanitarian distribution, partnership with the UNHCR. How we can do this? Again, this is too much headache for a small organization like us to build partnership with the UNAMA, EU, and Red Cross, or maybe IRC. Again, we would like Professor from LSE and Tobias to help us in building partnership with some of the large organizations in order to send some cash before the winter to Afghanistan. We receive hundreds of messages every day, and it causes so much headache, and thanks to God, or thanks to Allah, that I'm still alive. I don't have a heart attack. Receiving messages every day, please send us £20 just. Please send us £50 a month. But you don't see any even appeal on the TV, on Sky News or ITV, like we have so many appeals produced for the African community. When I see the Sky News or ITV during the news, they are advertising 1 minute's appeal. Please make £1 donation to save a child in Africa. To be honest, I haven't seen anything similar in YouTube for Afghanistan. So since Shabnam is telling me to finish my speech, I would like once again to thank you, Tobias and Professor Michael and everyone, and hope to see the second panel very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nasimi. You've ended on the right note about what practical steps need to be taken to help the people of Afghanistan, particularly with winter coming, and what the urgency is to feed people and prevent people from dying. And I think that's the blunt honesty that we've got to put at the centre of this. Can we give a warm thank you to our amazing panellists for taking the time, to listening to your questions, and although there aren't easy answers, unfortunately, but this is a long way that we've come already with the discussion. I know it's taken a bit of time, but thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, Tobias, for making the time to speak to Afghans, to speak and address our audience.